And you may have noted in the news media or on social media that the Greens, who will not form a substantive part of any government by the looks of current polling, the Greens have come out with a new policy ahead of the election. And these things, to be honest, tend to send me rigid. But the Greens certainly making a lot of noise about this and a lot of people reacting to that noise. The policy is one of regulated rents. Because, of course, as we know, the Greens are the friends of the battlers from Struggle Street. They are suggesting some form of government control of rent in this country, which has generally, I think, by the mainstream been rejected. So what is the proposal and what might be wrong with it? I might add the Greens are welcome to come along and talk about their policy proposal, but they don't talk to the platform. So I'm sorry, if you don't turn up, you don't get to have your say. We are joined now by economist for the New Zealand Initiative, Eric Crampton. Eric, how are you?
Pretty good. Yourself?
Not bad. Not bad. And whilst I'm not wearing makeup, Eric, I am sober. Eric, firstly, can you give me a broad overview of what the Greens' proposal on rent control is?
The Greens have proposed limiting rent increases to being no more than 3%, and if inflation is running below 3% or if wage increases are running below 3%, rents could not increase by more than the lowest of any of those. So if somehow we got inflation back down and wages were only rising at about 1%, well, rent control would restrict rent increases to about 1% a year. So rent could not be higher than 3%, unless in exceptional circumstances the landlord had made a deal with the existing tenants saying that they're going to do a bunch of reno that will improve insulation or whatever, and the landlord and the tenant had agreed that because the landlord was making this investment, rents could go up by an amount that they both agreed to. It's a bit of a recipe for disaster, really. Rent control tends not to work out very well at all. And this isn't just an Eric thing. This is the vast consensus of the broad mainstream of economics. You might find one or two weirdos that support them. But when we surveyed the country's economists on it, over 80% disagreed or strongly disagreed with rent controls. So we ran two surveys on this. One, a couple of years ago, we had the New Zealand Expert Economics Panel, and they were asked whether rent controls like those pursued in New York have had a positive impact on the amount and quality of affordable rental housing. And that was a smaller sample of economists. It was sort of selected experts, and there we had 82% of the country's economists disagreeing with rent controls or strongly disagreeing, about 5% agreeing, but I think that he might have just hit the wrong button on the survey. On the broader member survey, it was, again, 80% that disagreed or strongly disagreed, and again, with about maybe 6%, 6.5% that agreed.
There are some countries that do have rent controls, and a few in Europe who do this, Eric.
Sure, and these surveys wouldn't exist if these weren't in place, right? So the survey that we'd run the New Zealand Economic Association had run was built on a prior survey of American economists, which found a very similar result when looking at rent control in the U.S. And it means that there's been a lot of study of it. So economists will go in and
I come back, though. My question was, rent control does exist in some countries in Europe, doesn't it?
Sure, it exists in lots of places in various forms, and it exists within the United States as well. In New York, in San Francisco, lots of places will have rent controls. The effects will either range from fairly trivial if the maximum allowed rent increase is very high. So I think I'll have to double check my notes, but I think it was in Ireland that they're allowed to increase rents by about 10% a year. If the allowed rent increases are very low, then you see, a whole pile of distortions. So suppose that you're in a rent-controlled apartment and you've got a family, they grow up and the kids leave the house. If you leave, you're going to be going into having to compete for another rent-controlled apartment. Rent controls cause great shortages because people don't want to build when rents are controlled in that way. So you wind up being locked into an apartment that's too large for you. So that's one of the ways that rent controls cause distortions. People will stay for too long in a site that's not particularly fitting for them. That can have effects in labor markets. It'll reduce employment because people don't move to jobs when it's even harder to find a place to live because of rent control. They'll stay in places that are not really suited to them, and some places just don't come onto the market at all. So it's highly distortionary. It causes an awful lot of problems. In Sweden, rent-controlled apartments, there's a decade-long wait for them, okay? So if you want to get an apartment in Sweden...
so in Sweden, some places are rent-controlled and some aren't.
That's right. So under the rent-controlled ones, you turn 18, you get your name on the register, and you queue for them.
Yeah, well, that must mean they're good, Eric. People like them because there's demand. Isn't that the market working?
Well, wasn't it wonderful in the old Soviet Union when you had to wait 20 years to get a Trabant? Everybody loved the Trabants, right? Obviously. They're the world's best car. Can't you see how everybody's using them now?
Mm. But come on, Eric, I don't know that you've completely convinced me that this is such a crazy idea.
Well, they are common, so you can't say that it'll be a unique failing to New Zealand, but just think through some of the implications here. If your rent increases are limited to no more than 3% a year, think about your incentives to build rental properties in the first place. You are subject then to really tight controls on what rents might be, regardless of what's going on in the market. The Green Party's platform, it'd be great if you could get them on. If they don't want to come on, that's unfortunate. It didn't really spell out what happens for a new build. So if somebody does decide to build, despite the existence of rent controls, it doesn't really say what controls will be faced by these guys. It says what's required for existing landlords. So you can't raise your rents by more than 3% a year, or wage or price inflation if those are lower. And if you've got a new tenant that comes in, you have to consult some index of prevailing rents to tell you as a guideline of what you can charge, and you have to tell them what your prior tenants have been charged. So that's trying to avoid one obvious incentive under rent control, where you want to kick out the current tenants so that you can hike the rents if if rent control has meant that your rents are well below market. But if a new property comes onto the market, it doesn't really spell out what determines rents for those guys. So if I were still building a property under those circumstances, I would want to come in at the very high end of the market, just so I'm not as constrained by 3%, the highest of 3% a year, or inflation. So you can think through some of the other effects here. Right now, I guess just stepping back a little bit, the Greens are absolutely right that there is a massive problem. Okay, so there's a giant shortage of rental properties. There's a giant shortage of housing, full stop. Mm-hmm. And that has resulted in a lot of very serious harm. It's just that they've gone about trying to solve this the wrong way. If you were trying to solve this, you would want to increase the supply of housing, and then you could look at things like the Auckland Unitary Plan. So Ryan Greenaway-McGreevy, who is an economist, I think at Auckland University, had recently done some work showing that as a consequence of the Auckland Unitary Plan, rents on three-bedroom apartments in Auckland are about 20% lower, or maybe 30% lower than they otherwise might have been. Because there's more supply. So real rent control for economists means an ample supply of rental housing, so that landlords have to compete with each other for tenants. And that's the best protection a tenant can have. Is it having to go and plead to government that, for a rental warrant of fitness check, because this is something that the Greens have also proposed, that there'd be these armies of inspectors going out making sure that rental properties pass their WOF. You might wonder where they're going to find all of these inspectors. Is it better to have tenants have to go pleading to a government agency for help, or to have such a thick market of new commercial rental properties coming in that if your landlord is treating you bad, you say, well, bugger you, I'm going to go find somebody better.
All right, I now see what you're saying more clearly. There's another policy here, and the Greens clearly do target people who rent because they're into students voting for them, and they're into class warfare and all, those terrible people who own houses, like lots and lots of New Zealanders who stream at us. They are also very keen, Eric, and I wonder if you looked at this, on warrants of fitness for rental properties, and there are plenty of flats and houses for rent around this country which are not fit for human habitation or are bloody awful and full of mould and are cold. And the Greens say we need to do more to regulate that. So you can't offer a shoebox in the middle of the road as a rental property. Do you agree with that policy?
I think that it's terrible that people are wind up finding that as the best place that they can possibly find, right? So step back again. Why would somebody be choosing to live in such a terrible property if there were anything better available, right? It's a symptom of the underlying shortage. Now, if you came in with the woofs, that could be helpful, but look at the landlord's option again. If the site is deemed to be not good enough, the landlord either has to choose to invest to do the place up or to take it off of the market. If they choose to do the place up, that's great. Their rent would go up because that is subject to that negotiation. And the landlord could always... Well, I'm not sure quite what happens if the wolf says that the property isn't good enough and the tenant says that they would never allow there to be a rent increase because it's supposed to be negotiated, right? So there'd presumably be some dispute resolution mechanism that they'd have to go through on this. If the landlord says that this is all too much hassle, maybe they take it off the market. Now that you wouldn't expect that for a full house because then you're just leaving it sit idle. But there are lots of weird little properties that come in really, really terrible rental markets. So I think back to after the Christchurch earthquakes, my neighbor had people living in the back shed in her garden. Okay,
yeah.
It was a terrible situation caused by a natural disaster, and you see that anywhere after a natural disaster. But you will also see it when housing is in very limited supply. People living in garages, things that really, really shouldn't be used for housing if housing markets are working properly and if people can build new housing. If it's just too much hassle to rent out your garage to use as housing, and again, it's terrible that people are living in garages, right?
Yeah.
Nobody wants that. But if the wolf comes in and it's just too much hassle for the landlord, well, what happens to people who are living in the garage? Does this just magic up some new housing for them?
No, I guess we have social pressures that might cause other policies. I guess something will give somewhere else, Eric.
Yeah. Well, the Greens have proposed a big increase in social housing, and, well, I guess they're going to need it because it will knock a lot of these, pretty terrible properties out of the market, but the better response would be to outcompete them from the market because there are good new apartments coming on stream that people want to rent.
Okay, so you say on the logic, no to rent control because it will not work, it will lessen housing supply, but you're not entirely against the idea of a warrant of fitness for rental properties.
I think it's a lot less bad than rent control, but again, think about what happens if it fails the warrant of fitness and it is the best. If the place that's being rented is terrible, but it is the best option for the people who are in it, and then it comes off of the market, has that made those people better off? Right? That's a risk. It's also a worry where, suppose that you figured there is no chance of ever improving housing supply. In those circumstances, I would strongly favor something like a rental warrant of fitness, because if you've just given up that there's no way of getting competitive supply of rental properties coming in, you would probably want something like a rental warrant of fitness. But if you're able to get more supply onto the market, the burden of that policy does wind up shifting. So in a very constrained market, it should end up falling on landlords, but in a responsive market, just comes out of basic tax incidents, we don't have to get into it now, but in a more flexible market, it could instead wind up making renters worse off. So there's a bit of a risk there. To me, it feels like a policy that's given up on the prospect of doing better in housing markets.
All right. Eric, thank you for explaining that. So it's kind of a pity that we didn't have a Green spokesperson to debate the issue with you, because I think that in some ways would have been more productive. But I do now understand where you're coming from. Look, while I've got you here, I just want to ask you, I kind of survey everyone who rings in and we talk to today. Have you ever been to a meeting for something that turned out to be a meeting completely for something else and you were just mistaken?
Not that I can recall.
I
can't remember off the top, sorry.
Yeah, okay, but you don't think so. All right, I'm just trying to figure out how you get to a mongrel mob meeting and think it's an electoral commission meeting.
No, I've never had anything like that happen.
Eric, I thank you very much indeed for your time. We'll talk soon. That is Eric Crampton from the New Zealand Initiative, explaining why the Greens' rent control policy really will be counterproductive to people who rent. What do you think? But it's classic Green politics. It is class divide. It is those evil capitalist landlords, workers' rights and all that, lads. Geez, it would have been nice to have. And I'm going to say this more and more as the election approaches. Please engage. If you want your ideas, if you do not have the confidence that you can go up against Eric Crampton if you're a Green Party MP, well, that says something about you, doesn't it? But I can promise you a fair hearing here on the platform. And by the way, we're not a mongrel mob station. This is an electoral commission meeting. This is media. This is new media, and it's talk radio. Few people actually taking me seriously. Totally agree with why did we give them the vote? Because I was just looking at Ingrid Leary, Tory Whanau, Kerry Allen, all women. Why did we give them the vote? Why did we let them take part in politics? Give them the mess they're called. And that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek response because, look, I know most of you people who listen to the platform are actually pretty normal. You don't live in Wellington. You don't run around on Twitter losing your minds and thinking about Elon Musk every day. You get on with it. You're on your tractors and you're on in your cars and you're going to work and you're taking care of the kids. Happy school holidays, kids, if you're listening. Nice to have you with us. And you take care of and you mind your own business and you pay your taxes and you get on with it. But there are a bunch of people, particularly on social media, who spend their whole time being tribal spin doctors, most of them not appointed or paid, most of them very self-important. And they spend their time online trying to say that their tribe or team in politics is better than the other team. And at the moment, the lefty social media people are all saying that Tory Whanau and Kerry Allen, they haven't got into Ingrid. The problem with Ingrid Leary, she's a former journalist and she's white. So Ingrid doesn't quite get on the sympathy meter, on the woke sympathy meter. Ingrid's not really in the sweet spot. But like Kerry Allen, gay Maori woman, she had a wheelchair, that'd be it. She'd be unassailable. And Tory Whanau, of course, is a Maori or Wahine Tawa. I think they call them Wahine Tawa. But apparently all this stuff, all these controversies are because the world is run by post-colonial white males. It is the most ridiculous claim you have ever seen, folks. And I know to most of you would scratch your head about that and you actually get on with your real lives and it makes no difference.